Welcome to our fourth annual webinar series, co-hosted by the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies and the Korea Institute for Maritime Strategy. It's my pleasure to moderate this year's event. I'm Dr. James Minnick, Colonel U.S. Army retired and professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, or DKI APCSS. In today's U.S.-Korea-Japan Trilateral webinar, we'll examine the topic of China's maritime strategy and allies' responses. We welcome three distinguished speakers. Dr. Lukas Filler is a professor at DKI APCSS. He's a respected expert on the strategic logic and implications of PRC decisions and behavior. He began his professional career as a naval aviator and earned a PhD from King's College, London, Department of War Studies. Dr. Duk-ki Kim is vice chairman of the Korea Association of Military Studies and non-resident research fellow of KIMS. A retired rear admiral, he served as assistant secretary to the senior defense secretary for the South Korean president. He earned a PhD from the University of Hull in the United Kingdom. Mr. Tetsuo Kotani is a professor at Maritime University and a senior fellow at Japan Institute of International Affairs. His research focus is Japan's foreign and security policy, the U.S.-Japan alliance, and international relations and maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. He received a master's degree from JIIA University. Now, our speakers will each present for 15 minutes. Dr. Filler will present on China's maritime strategy, Dr. Kim on China's maritime expansion and challenges for maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, and Professor Kotani on joint responses by the U.S. and Japan to China's maritime strategy. At the conclusion of Professor Kotani's remarks, the Korea Institute for Maritime Strategy, or KIMS, will open our discussion session. We invite our participants to submit questions and comments in the Q&A chat box. We will now turn over to Professor Filler.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Continue.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me this morning. It's great to be here, and it's great to be part of this great panel of experts. In the next 15 minutes or so, what I was hoping to do is just do a very quick, broad outline of sort of the Chinese, generally speaking, its geostrategic thinking and perspective, and how that plays out in its evolution of its maritime strategy, which mostly focuses on the Indo-Pacific region, although has expanded over the last few years. So to start, one needs to think about sort of China's unique geography and how that, and history, and how that's shaped its perspective. So on the right, you'll see a slide or a graphic that was made by The Economist. For a general explanation, you may not always agree with some of the characterizations it makes of China's neighbors, and I don't always agree with all of it, but the point that it makes is that China, starting from very early in its history, has not been blessed with a good geography. It's been surrounded on all sides and continues to be surrounded on all sides by other countries or maritime borders, which have been subject to a substantial amount of instability. So for perhaps some of our listeners who may be from places such as Mongolia, for example, which is where I am right now, the characterizations may not seem 100% accurate. And for those who may not be familiar with the term frenemy, which is one of the characterizations in the bottom, that is a portmanteau of friend and enemy. And it is a slang term used in America to suggest that those countries, the relations with China, are not overtly hostile, but they're not 100% friendly. They don't have a lot of trust, but there's no major conflicts at the time. Similarly, if you see the ones that are labeled fragile or failing states, once again, that may be a controversial conclusion, but the point there simply being that in China's history, over thousands of years, it has experienced large time periods of disorder and chaos and conflict, and some periods where there has been a lot of stability. And what this has done has created a sense in Chinese strategic culture that stability is essential to the good of the country. And all these countries, many of these countries have had historical disputes, whether it's territorial disputes or otherwise, that cause China to continue to have a very heightened sensitivity to any possible threat, especially on its periphery. The blue icons I added to the slide to show where in the last 100 years, China has had some form of armed conflict or another. Once again, what this has done is it has encouraged a land power traditional view from China. When you think about sort of what have added to some of the concerns and the hypersensitivity to all threats, what are the priorities in China in order for it to secure its borders and to ensure the most ideal conditions for economic development and safety of its people? Some of the constraints are not only just the threats that it perceives around its borders over thousands of years, but also it is a country that is not blessed with a lot of generous natural resources. So for example, you'll see on my slide here, the next couple of slides will have just a few facts about this. China has limited arable land, 7% to feed 22% of the population. It faces shortages in many natural resources necessary for a country to evolve. And this plays right into a predisposed bias to look at the world in what we would call a political realist terms. And that would be, according to international relations theory, the idea that the world is a chaotic, anarchic place where all countries are desperately fighting over limited resources, usually natural resources such as energy, food, and water, in order to survive. And what this means is that any country that manages to secure those resources is likely to grow strong. And the countries that do not have those resources or cannot gather those resources, they will become weak and become vulnerable to stronger powers. And so countries must do everything they can in order to secure these resources. The problem with that is it means that it's essentially a dog-eat-dog world, and ideals, morality, and goodwill and trust are often seen as dangerous obstacles for the survival of the country. In the case of China, obviously, this means that there's a strong reliance on imports, food security, as well as water security. China is not blessed with a lot of water. It tends to be a pretty dry place, which between arable land as well as water, it makes it quite difficult for China to ensure that it has enough food to feed its people. Additionally, not only do you have those 14 states or countries around China, which have had varying degrees of positive and negative relationships with China over the years, but China's coastline is, as you will know from maps, the coastline is quite large. And although China has been traditionally a land power focused on land power threats or threats from its land borders, in the last 150 years, whether it was Japan or sort of Western countries, the most recent, largest, most dramatic threats to China have come from the sea. Also, as China has sort of liberalized a little bit its production and manufacturing economy, most of that has been focused on the coastal areas. And with that have come a large migration of the Chinese population to the coastal areas. So this has caused China to slowly shift some of its priorities and some of its concerns from its land borders, where it has also managed to largely not resolve its territorial disputes, but at least put them aside. Some of the one of the major exceptions to that, of course, is India. But for the other ones, there's still a substantial amount of tension, but the relations have been stabilized, allowing China to start focusing a little more on its more recent vulnerabilities along its coastline. So you can see from this slide as well that China's coastline is incredibly important to its global trade, which it has in recent past, but continues to link global trade and overseas development and economic opportunities to seeing those as essential for its continued rise in order to achieve what it calls national rejuvenation, which might be considered its idea of resuming its rightful place at the top of at least the regional hierarchy, if not the global hierarchy. One of the things that we see in Chinese writing, not so much in the doctrinal writing, but a lot in both scholarly writing, as well as sort of what is implied as China has evolved its security strategies and national defense white papers. It has increasingly talked about not just protecting its coastline and not even just the East China Sea and the South China Sea, but even more so, it believes, much like it views the United States, that its global interests as well as its global obligations and desire for global influence have continued to increase in what it believes is commensurate. It's in proportion with as it has grown in its own national power. And this has been enshrined, again, in some of its authoritative documents. For example, its 2015 National Defense White Paper is one of the first mentions where it starts saying that its national security is directly linked to overseas global development. Because of this, added with the addition of its hypersensitivity to threats because of its history, because of its geography, it has continued to have a very, very strong concern, a sense of vulnerability that other countries could have a drastic impact on its economic well-being very quickly by simply shutting access to the ports on its east coast. It will, they often call this the Malacca dilemma. And so one of the things we see is that One Belt, One Road, or BRI, many of its infrastructure projects are focused on its south and west, whether it's pipelines or roads or railroads and things like that. It is making a number of very ambitious and large-scale construction efforts to provide other means for it to both export, but more importantly, import in ways to mainland China that do not involve the Malacca Straits. This is largely focused on energy because China is quite energy dependent, but it does include other goods as well. One of the interesting things about this is you could see the quote above, and this was a professor who was considered sort of one of the leading early scholars in China about its maritime security. And I think it encapsulates pretty well a very contemporary view of sort of Chinese concerns about its economic security and how that relates to its national security. So going through sort of history of Chinese strategic thinking and geostrategic thinking, there is a fair amount of recognition of both Western land power and sea power theorists. For example, Mackinder being one of the most notable land power, but also people like Mahan with sea power. I would say, and I'd love to hear the thoughts of my colleagues, I would say that China generally still has a land power view, even of the East China Sea and the South China Sea. The East China Sea and South China Sea are treated more like buffer areas to keep possible enemies and threat manageable, whereas a Mahanian viewpoint might view the East China Sea and the South China Sea as a means of projecting power further from shore. But at the same time, I wanted to point out a couple historical traditional Chinese strategists, which have been quoted by Chinese scholars in terms of or in reference to its maritime strategy. So you can see at the bottom just very quick summaries of a couple very old Chinese strategies that are enshrined in its military classics, which still influence how China views pursuing its maritime security and its maritime interests. Now, I'm going to be very brief on this because this slide is intended simply to segue into my next colleague and his presentation. So I will just call your attention to the two quotes on the top right, which I think are very good because obviously they're authoritative. They very clearly represent the CCP's core beliefs, as well as Xi Jinping's priorities and his geostrategic perspectives. The main point here is that there has been a shift in Chinese thinking, and it has been very clearly traced from a near seas to a far seas to expanding into greater responsibility and a sense of the right and obligation for China to play a greater role further from its shores, using the maritime environment as the avenue and the domain from which to do this. So I think I will stop right around here because I'm at time, and that this would be my last slide anyway. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is that part of this expansion is the idea that China has always and still continues to define its periphery as its primary national security priorities. However, how it has defined its periphery has also changed. And I've seen, and I can pull it up if anyone would like to see it, a couple authoritative quotes talking about in modern times with the increasing risks from global instability. At the time of these writings, it was more Ukraine, Gaza had not happened, but it talked about expanding what it calls its periphery, even into places such as the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Islands. And with that, thank you very much for your time. I know that was very quick and high level, but I only intended to bring up a couple issues that I hope will both set up my next colleague, but also generate some discussion. So thank you again.
Thank you for that, Lukas. And in fact, it is starting to do that, generate some discussion. Would encourage others to continue to add some in the Q&A box. We do have some that we'll bring up for discussion after we conclude our presentations. At this time, we'd invite our colleague, Dr. Duk-ki Kim to join us and to bring up your presentation, and then the floor will be yours.
Okay, thank you, James. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm very honored to take part in this important Trilateral webinar today. First of all, I want to convey my special thanks to KIM's APCSS and Professor Minich for support and provide that kind of special seminar today. And as you can see on the slide, today's PLAN has been able to grow into a blue water navy that can challenge to the U.S. Navy with the strong support of leaders from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping. In particular, right-hand side, and Xi Jinping has been recently emphasized the importance of the maritime power, recognizing that the military, especially the Navy, must be supported in order to achieve China dream. As you can see on the slide, my content are as follows from introduction, China's maritime expansion to conclusion. My presentation purpose is to evaluate China's maritime expansion and challenges, and also suggest how should we respond to China's challenges. I will skip the China's maritime strategy because that area was presented by the Professor Filler, explained in detail. And first, I explained the China's maritime expansion. China's maritime power consists of Navy, Coast Guard, and maritime militia. Total maritime force personnel are around 600,000. Navy, 260,000, and Coast Guard around 17,000, as well as the maritime militia, 300,000. As you know, the Chinese Navy began to surface the US Navy in total numbers of naval vessels starting in 2015. Recently, the paramilitary forces of the Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime militia have continued to strengthen their power and are actively intervening in the territorial dispute in the South China and East China Seas. I will explain the challenges posed by China's maritime expansion. When it comes to China's maritime expansion, there are many challenges for maritime security in the region. I will explain 7 challenges as follows. The first challenge is that, as you can see on the slide, the US and China have different perceptions of maritime strategy. For example, China focuses on non-traditional maritime security issues such as maritime hegemony competition and territorial disputes. Nonetheless, the US focuses on non-traditional maritime threats such as piracy, terrorism, pollution, and illegal fishing. Okay. And the second challenge factor is the recent growing gap in naval power between US and China. In particular, China is expanding its influence in the 5 oceans, including Indian Ocean, based on One Belt and Road Initiative. On the other hand, the US Navy's naval power declining due to defense limitations. It appears that it will become difficult to maintain its influence in the region. TV page. The third challenging factor is China's maritime expansion ambitious through expanding overseas naval bases. As you can see on the slide, China in particular has linked its past Pearl Necklace strategy with the Belt and Road Initiative proposed by the Xi Jinping and many years ago. And also China is investing a huge amount of money to build a port in other countries and secure overseas bases in the form of lease. For example, in 2017, China secured its first naval base in Djibouti, and there is growing conflict with the existing US military base. And the first challenging factor is China's threat to Taiwan. And last August, China blockaded Taiwan and the Pacific Straits through which major maritime transportation routes of Korea and Japan. In particular, China blockaded Taiwan and the Pacific Straits with missiles and naval vessels when Taiwan was threatened last August. Okay, 16페이지. 16. And also, the fifth, it is related to construction of artificial islands and military bases in the South China Sea. To secure sovereignty over the South China Sea, China has been expanding construction of military bases in the South China Sea, starting with the construction of military bases in JIIA Island since early 2000. Recently, China has been building 10 artificial islands, including in the South China Sea, and completed military bases on 3 islands. As you can see on the right-hand slide, these military bases consist of airships around 3 kilometers and also hangars and ports. Total pierce length is around 700 meters. It means that aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines can be deployed there. 7th challenges, and there is a dispute in the East China Sea. There are 3 hot issues among Korea, Japan, and China. First issue is that 200 nautical miles EEZs are overlapped by the 3 countries. Second issue is the continental shelf boundaries among the 3 countries. And the last issue is that the ADIZ issue by the 3 countries. Currently, China frequently invaded Korea, Japan, AGIG by itself, sometimes with a Russian aircraft. The last and final challenging is growing conflict as China cooperation with Russia to secure exclusive control over the Arctic Ocean. Each page. Measures for maritime security cooperation, there are 3 tracks, track 1 through track 2. In the case of track 1 cooperation, there are ASEAN and ASEAN Regional Forum, Double Defense Dialogue, and WPNS meetings. Track 1.5 combined by track 1 and track 2. Track 2, there are SysCam meeting by the civilian experts. Down page. And also, we have 3 kinds of areas to enhance maritime security cooperation measures in the region. First area is the law and the regime, UNCLOS and the PCA. The problem is that China ignored that decision by this kind of international law and regime or regulations. Second part is the political and institutional measures, such as ASEAN Maritime Forum and the Code of Conduct and the RECAP. And the last, military and Coast Guard cooperation, WPNS, and also North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. RK Navy is currently actively participating to enhance maritime cooperation with other countries, such as multilateral meeting, join and host, and combined exercise with the US and Japan. We are joining the anti-piracy operation, the Gulf of Aden. Nevertheless, in order to build maritime trust, we need to continue building a strategic relationship of trust between US and China and guarantee freedom of navigation in the high seas. Additionally, in order to reduce maritime disputes in the region, we also need to continue political dialogue between nation actors, refrain from using territorial disputes politically, and avoid aggressive foreign policies. In addition, I believe that if we jointly respond to non-traditional threats, such as combating piracy in the region, trust will continue to be built and maritime instability can be reduced. How we should mitigate maritime conflicts? I think that the political dialogue is strongly required, and also non-military engagement we try to enforce. How should we against the translational threat in the region and remove root causes of piracy and other translational threats? We also enhance or strengthen bilateral, multilateral labor and cultural cooperation is strongly required based on humanitarian aid and disaster relief operations. In conclusion, I propose the following 4 areas to build maritime peace and stability against China's maritime expansion and challenges in the region. First, there is a need for rapid information exchange regarding MDA in the region. Second, we must continue to strengthen maritime trust building. In particular, information sharing has become more important than ever before to respond to maritime threats from North Korea, China, and Russia. As far as I know, Japan is acquiring MDA-related information more right time than Korea by operating Sea Guardian UAV systems. Third, I think it is necessary for us to continue to push and persuade China to follow international laws and norms, such as UN Convention Law of the Sea and Code of Conduct, which was agreed by China and ASEAN. And lastly, considering the lack of maritime capabilities of ASEAN countries, I strongly suggest that Korea, US, and Japan should support these countries' effort to increase their maritime power to respond to China. For example, Korea has been providing retired naval ships to the Philippines and Vietnam for many years. In addition, RK Navy's the Marine Command provides submarine training and education programs to other countries, including ASEAN. That's all my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Kim. We look forward to hearing from our third and final panelist, Professor Kotani. And over to you, Tetsuo.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the webinar organizers, and I really miss wonderful climate in Honolulu. So my topic is about the U.S.-Japan joint response to maritime security, maritime strategy of China. So let me briefly describe what China's maritime strategy has been. So in the 1980s, China shifted its focus of maritime strategy from the coastal defense to offshore defense, assuming the two island chains. And I think this move was mainly driven by China's territorial ambitions and also a need for counter intervention against the United States. I think the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis was a turning point for China's maritime strategy. At that time, China conducted a missile exercise against Taiwan's first ever democratic presidential election. In response, the United States dispatched two carrier strike groups. And because of that, China needed to suspend their missile exercises. But China was very much humiliated by this incident, and thereafter they accelerated their efforts to develop what we call A2AD and what China calls the counter-intervention capabilities. Initially, China tried to develop their capabilities by purchasing the Soviet-era destroyers and submarines. And also they have developed their Coast Guard capabilities and also the maritime militia, so that they can conduct the so-called gray zone coercion against the neighboring countries. And developing those capabilities, China became more aggressive around 2008 inside the first island chain and beyond. As we all remember, China started the intrusion of the territorial waters of the Senkaku Islands in December 2008. And also we had an incident in the East China Sea in 2010 and 2012. And today, China has developed the indigenous capabilities, including highly capable cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers. They also have developed the air-launched cruise missiles and ground-launched ballistic missiles, including the anti-ship ballistic missiles to target the moving ships. And these massive and highly accurate firepower is supported by China's space, cyber, and electronic warfare capabilities. And China is also enhancing their joint operation capabilities by reorganizing the 5 combat theater commands. And as China develops its maritime strategy and capabilities, the United States and Japan became very much worried. And our primary concern was China tried to neutralize the military bases in Japan, both self-defense forces and the US military, by ballistic missiles when there's a armed conflict involving China. And also we also are concerned about the China's possible occupation of the Japan's southwestern island chain, so that they can utilize those island chain as a forward base to prevent US reinforcements. And facing those challenges, the United States tried to develop the concept of air-sea battle. And also the Japan developed the concept of dynamic joint defense force. So by developing the joint air-sea battle concept, the United States tried to overcome the A280 environment, while Japan tried to shift the focus of the defense from the defense of Hokkaido in the north to the defense of southwestern island chain in the south. And the two countries revised the bilateral defense cooperation guidelines in 2015 to clarify their division of labor in a possible regional conflict. And under that guideline, Japan is going to take the primary role to defend the southwestern island chain, while the United States providing supporting capabilities. And also under this bilateral guidelines, the two governments established a alliance coordination mechanism so that they can share the intelligence and operational picture at all time. Despite those developments, the big challenge remained, which was the so-called missile gap. China developed a massive theater missile capabilities, which could destroy all the US military bases in the Western Pacific, while the US and Japan lacked such capabilities. And because of that, for example, the US strategy, including the air-sea battle, assumed the US stays away from the front line, at least initially, to avoid being destroyed by those missiles. The problem was because the Japan self-defense forces are a resident force, and we have no place to hide. So the self-defense forces needed to be a stand-in force, even under the A280 capabilities. So how to overcome this gap remained a huge challenge for the alliance. And meanwhile, in 2016, when President Tsai Ing-wen took the presidency in Taiwan, China started a massive military pressure campaign against Taipei. And US and Japan started to prepare a possible Taiwan contingency. And then the Trump administration decided to withdraw from the INF treaty, and which opened up opportunity for the US to develop medium-range ground-based missile capabilities in the theater. And now the US Marine Corps and the US Army developing those longer-range capabilities to become a standing force under the A280 capabilities, A280 environment. So, for example, the US Marine Corps is now transforming the Marine Expeditionary Unit into the Marine Littoral Regiment to conduct the EABO operation. And the US Army is now forming a multi-domain operational forces in the theater. And those forces will be equipped with a longer range capabilities, such as the HIMARS, Tomahawks, and in the case of US Army, the longer range hypersonic weapons. Those forces would not be vulnerable to A2AD, and they can be a standing force under the A2AD environment. And plus, under the 2022 National Security Strategy, the Japanese government decided to acquire longer range strike capabilities with increased defense budget. So now both the United States and Japan could maintain a robust standing force even under the A280 capabilities. And those standing forces could provide operational space for the Navy and Air Force. The partnerships with the regional countries are also important. For example, the United States just agreed to expand the facilities which they can access in the Philippines under the EDCA. And also that Japan is now negotiating with the Philippines about the possible visiting forces agreement so that self-defense forces can use the facilities in the Philippines. And the United States has been expanding its access to the Australian bases and facilities, while the Japan concluded the reciprocal access agreement with Australia. And now our Air Force is conducting training in Australia. And in terms of the Navy, the Japan is now acquiring smaller frigates without reducing firepower, so that we can operate more ships with fewer crews. And the United States Navy is focusing on the distributed lethality so that they can maintain their capabilities under the A280 environment. And the Pentagon just announced the replicator initiative to operate thousands of drones in a possible or armed conflict against China. So before concluding, let me say a few words about Japan-US-Korea cooperation. We just had a historic summit meeting at the Camp David in August. And now that South Korea is very much interested in doing a maritime security cooperation with both Japan and the United States, I think that would open up a good opportunity for the three countries to work on the maritime security. For example, we can cooperate in the case of Taiwan blockade, and also we can cooperate more in the South China Sea. So by doing those developments, I think Japan and the United States have a better chance to disrupt China's theory of victory if China starts a war. And we could make the strategic calculation of China more difficult. And then I think we can enhance the deterrence. But challenges remain for the alliance. For example, we have to further coordinate our C2 cooperation. Our C2 structure will continue to be parallel, but as Japan is now establishing a permanent joint operational command, I think we should consider how we can further facilitate our C2 cooperation. And also we have to start the negotiation of a possible deployment of US Army units in Japan, as US Army is now developing the longer range capabilities. So as we overcome those challenges, I think we can better enhance our deterrence. So I'll stop here.
Oh, that was fascinating as well. So thank you very much for that, Tetsuo. I'd invite the other panelists to go ahead and turn the cameras on, and we'll go ahead and go into the question and answer session. As I had indicated at the beginning, we want to turn over to our co-host, Korea Institute for Maritime Strategy, for some opening questions or thoughts. I know that Duk, you have at least one, but there may be some others, and so we'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Hello, Dr. James Minish. This is Sakabli. I thank you very much for your very well organized webinar. I think you devoted a lot for this webinar. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question to Dr. Lukas Filler about my question is, China is ongoing, very serious threat in terms of when we look at the South China Sea. China is actually building lots of military facilities and infrastructures, and it's not potential. Actually, the threat is here. So I think we need to do some kind of action rather than just freedom of navigation operations. I think we need to do more active, proactive, actions against those behavior, such as neutralizing, Chinese constructed airfields like that. Why we are discussing this way of Volvo seminar and then just navigating around their area, and then they are actually building and then they are achieving their strategic goals. So I think United States Navy and Korean Navy, also Japan Navy, self-defense forces, I think we need to do some more active, measures against those Chinese threat issues. What's your thoughts on, on this? This question for Dr. Lukas Filler, please.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lee. Absolutely, I agree with you. I tried to sort of trace from the Chinese perspective the growing global ambitions, but I absolutely agree with you that even as China says, its periphery is its priority. And so the majority, I think, of the increasing risks from China do come in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. I think one of the challenges to find ways to respond to China's increasing, both aggressive and assertive behavior, but also, as you said, how to respond to its increasing militarization, despite, as we all know, Xi Jinping's overt agreement on camera to not further militarize the South China Sea. My sense is that it obviously this is a tricky. I think one way we can do this is simply presence. The idea is that we often look at military operations and security as addressing active threats, and in some cases that works. But in the East China Sea and especially in the South China Sea, the growing Chinese presence, as well, of course, as its capabilities, need a counter to both reassure, partners and allies in the region, but also to remind China that, our coalition is not going anywhere, and we will not be intimidated or coerced. I think we do not necessarily need large, for example, ships. We don't need capital ships. We don't need aircraft carriers. Because the way that China's approaching this is through smaller ships, but a large presence. So whether it's the Maritime Militia, the Coast Guard, the Maritime Safety Administration. And I think that, maybe trying to respond a little more in kind might help. If we had a larger number and a larger consistent presence of smaller but capable ships from all the partners and allies that you mentioned, plus more, I think that would be an effective, at least first step in that direction. FONOPs, Taiwan Strait Transits, they help, but as you know, FONOPs are not targeted at any single country. They are apolitical. And so to use them for political purposes, I think would be something of a mistake, right? But the only difference between a FONOP and, for example, presence operations is their intent and how close to disputed features they get. What's important is the constant presence, and I think we can do that through lots of smaller ships, especially in coalitions. Thank you.
We've got questions which are quite similar to that, which let me ask, and then we'll go back to Kim's to go for a follow-on. But the without the buildup, because the buildup was actually fairly close to what was just presented, the question really is, how can the U.S. deal with its currently very slow pace of building new ships and maintaining the ones that it has? Several of the aircraft carriers are, of course, in repair at any given time, and so Lukas, would you like to continue that train of thought with that response?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is more U.S. Coast Guard and other Coast Guards as well. So the U.S. Coast Guard obviously has limited capacity, but they have a number of ships, especially their national security cutters, which have increasing capacity and I think convey a degree of presence and resistance that I think does have a powerful signal. I absolutely agree with you that some of the recent sort of crises, whether it's Ukraine, but especially Gaza, I am concerned that these are providing something of a distraction for the US and others. We are sort of following the bright, shiny object, which is not to say that we shouldn't react to Gaza. That's a very important issue that the United States needs to exert military presence in. But we need to also keep in mind what that might mean for the Asia-Pacific region. And so at least being careful about and very considerate about reallocation of Indo-Pacific forces to other AORs is important. The other one I would suggest is, when we talk about Indo-Pacific, the numbers of forces assigned to the US Indo-Pacific Command, many will point to that and say it has the largest number of forces of any of the geographic combatant commands. While that's true, it is also it is the only geographic combatant command where forces that are in the United States count towards the total numbers. Those forces in the United States are ready to be moved further into theater, but they're not authorized and funded unless there's a crisis. And I think that our government could probably, it's not a matter of money, it's a matter of sort of focus. I think if our Congress focused a little bit on the implications, we could assign and fund some of those forces and send them further west, including, for example, Third Fleet in San Diego, but also a lot of land forces in the Pacific Northwest. So I think that would be an easy response to use some existing forces. But I'd be really interested to hear what colleagues have to say about other ideas.
Tetsuo?
Well, just recently, the US and Japan agreed to utilize the Japanese ship repair facility for repairing and also maintaining the US Navy's ships. I think this is a very significant advance. And also, as both Japan and the United States now understands the importance of refacilitating the domestic defense industrial basis, I think US and Japan should consider kind of a cooperation in shipbuilding. Under the national defense, national security strategy of Japan, we have more budget for defense industry. So perhaps we can cooperate on this shipbuilding together with the United States.
Thank you. Back over to Kim's for either follow-on thoughts on that one or present a new one.
English 좋아.
Mm.
First of all, let me say hello to Mr. Kotani. Do you remember the symposium on East Asia Security Seas in 2010 in Hawaii? I remember what you have said anyway. When you were in Auckland in New Zealand, you said the Greenpeace movement. It was a very impressive remarks anyway. I want to ask 2 questions to you. As I remember your constitution, the self-defense force can use real military force only for defending your territory, not attacking some target in enemy territory. But when there is a need to attack some target in enemy territory, US can do that. That's my understanding. When you refer to defending the Luke Island, I mean the archipelago in the southwest area, US role is to assist Japan, and the Japan self-defense forces is to defend those islands. In this case, if there is a need to attack some target in Chinese territory, question is who can do that? The second one is, I know there are lots of cooperation measures being taken for protecting your sea lanes of communication together with US Navy. So in this case, can you tell us more on the US and Japan cooperation measure to protect US flags?
Well, thank you very much for the 2 questions. So the first one is kind of controversial, even in Japan. But first of all, in defending our southwestern island chain, the primary mission for the self-defense forces will continue to be defending our territory from incoming enemy forces. But as China develops the massive missile forces, which could hit Japan from mainland China, under the 2022 National Security Strategy, we decided to introduce the longer range strike capabilities and what we call the counter-strike capabilities. So we will purchase the Tomahawk missiles from the United States, and also we will extend our existing anti-ship missile so that we can strike the enemy territory if necessary. Our primary target will continue to be the incoming forces, both Navy and Air Force. But in the case of Air Force, it's more reasonable strike the airbase before the aircraft takes off. So the Japanese government officially stated that the enemy airbase could be a target of our counter-strike capabilities, but we understand this is an extension of our denial capabilities rather than the massive punishment. And the second question about how Japan and the United States are defending our slugs. Well, so jointly and separately, we are conducting patrol presence operations throughout our slugs, not only in the Western Pacific, but also in the Indian Ocean. But more and more, Japan and the United States are working with other partners, including Australia, India, Canada, and even the European countries such as UK, France, and Germany. And of course, we are working closely with the southeastern Asian countries. And here we very much welcome the South Korea to join in defending the slugs from Western Pacific to the Indian Ocean.
Thank you for that. Any other follow-ups from either you there, Dr. Chung, or anybody at Kim's before we go to the larger set of questions?
I think it's all the questions done from Kim's. I think the floor is yours.
Okay, we have several questions, as you might guess, given the present geopolitical situation that deals with the ongoing crisis in Gaza, in Israel, and its ramifications upon the US's projection capability and the requirements or the necessity of strengthening relations over here. So with that broad overarching set of questions that are asked in this one, Lukas, over to you first. I would also, though, imagine that both our colleagues in Japan and Korea share concerns, at least, about this situation in the U.S.'s projection capability. So we'll let the group handle it. But over to you first, Lukas.
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
The U.S.'s ability to respond in the region despite the growing crisis in the Middle East.
Absolutely. I mean, so the U.S. has talked for a long time about the ability to fight wars on two fronts. I know I saw in some of the questions and comments that there was concern about the U.S.'s defense industrial base and its capacity. That is, I think, a very reasonable concern. But I also think that history has shown that the U.S., amongst others, is able to increase its capacity, manufacturing capacity, quite quickly. And I've seen some bits of news that is already happening. And I think also we should not discount our allies and partners and their abilities. We've worked for decades to increase our interoperability for this kind of reason, is the ability for us to use each other's equipment and to work together as force multipliers. And so I think that this might be a great opportunity to sort of do a little bit of a real world test of all that joint and combined training. You know, if we collectively feel that we need to increase our military presence or activity in the Indo-Pacific region, this is what us in Japan and Korea and the Philippines and many other countries have been training for. Let's do it. Let's try and see how well all that training has worked. I'm not suggesting a full mobilization for war, but if there is a sense within the region that the issues in Gaza and Ukraine have diverted some military capability and capacity elsewhere, it might be a good idea for us all to work together to see what we can do together to address that in terms of military interoperability. I would also say that the United States has tremendous reserve forces, maybe to some extent hardware, but in terms of people, I was a Navy reservist, and James, I think you had some time in the reserves as well. The U.S. military reserves are exceptionally professional and are quite prepared. It wasn't that long ago where we were sending tens of thousands of reservists to the Middle East for a year at least. Our training and our readiness in the reserves have not taken a break. I can assure you that. And that's what they're there for, is to surge in times of need. And so should there actually be some kind of crisis in the Indo-Pacific, there are hundreds of thousands of US military reserves that stand ready. They practice every month for this kind of situation. And so I have a great deal of confidence that as long as we are not so distracted, we miss important indicators and we fail. As long as we manage to react quickly in terms of any kind of crisis or escalation to hopefully avoid something bigger, between us and our allies and partners, we have plenty of capacity and capability to respond in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Okay, Tetsuo?
Well, from U.S. allies' perspective, I personally am not so much worried about the U.S. capability and capacity to deal with possible Asian conflict. But my concern is more about the political will. Look at the recent Republican House members' move. They tried to package the support for Israel with a reduction of IRS budget, which is not logical at all. But still, it's a reality in the U.S. domestic politics. So we have to wonder how much the U.S. Congress and the domestic politics could survive the ongoing crisis and also the additional crisis.
Well, those are pressing issues right now. Thank you for that. Duk-ki, any comments about this?
And as you know, around 25 years ago, there was a hot issue related to two major regional conflicts will be happened simultaneously, where U.S. can effectively managing that situation. Nowadays in Korea, there are hot discussion is that during the Taiwan crisis, U.S. forces in Korea will be deployed or not. Many high-ranking generals of USFK in Korea and during the Taiwan crisis, U.S. forces will deploy to Taiwan. But nonetheless, North Korea will also make some provocation to South. How can we handle that situation? But current Hamas and Israel situation is almost same. So internally in Korea, we are still wondering, U.S. will managing that situation more than two crises or conflicts in the Middle East and in East Asia is possible. So nonetheless, our U.S. alliance is currently very strong and we can handle them. But nonetheless, many Koreans are still wondering how to do that. Okay, thank you.
Tetsuo rightly brought up there's concerns about political reliability or conviction. And Lukas had said that he thought that there was adequate capacity. I was reminded of just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Army Pacific Commander, General Charles Flynn, speaking at the U.S. Army's annual meeting, an exposition in D.C. He had talked about three strengths that China has: interior lines, meaning they're within 100 miles of Taiwan, so they're that proximity that clearly gives the strength of their A2AD capability that we spoke about earlier, that staying power that they have to be able to deny. They've got large mass. We spoke about that. One thing we didn't speak much about is magazine depth, large quantities of standoff munitions. And this has come to be a forefront issue as even in the present war in Ukraine. And I think that an astute logistician amongst us would say that that is perhaps not as strong a suit as we ought to have as magazine depths, one that can sustain for a long time given the existing munitions. And that's probably just not a U.S. concern, but allies as well, whether the amount of munitions available, precision munitions, etc., in Korea and Japan. Any thoughts or comments about this as a need? And that probably goes back to political issues as well and funding for those things. But any thoughts, Tetsuo, and then over to Duk-ki on
Well, one of the big challenges we face is the lack of the production capabilities, particularly for the ammunition and precision guided missiles. And this is part of the reasons why we revised our national security strategy, so that we can build up more capabilities. But as the war in Ukraine goes on, both United States and the European allies provided too many ammunitions to Ukraine, and their production capabilities are not matching the need from the Ukraine. And now we have Israel fighting against Hamas. And although what Ukraine needs basically different from what the Israeli forces need, but for example, the howitzer artillery is something common equipment for both, and these capabilities is very important in this theater as well. So I think this is not the problem for any single country. This is a collective problem, and I think the US and its allies across the globe needs to address this issue very quickly.
Give that. Becky, thoughts?
I have one question to James or Lukas, and about the Arctic Ocean security issue, and currently China and Russia strongly cooperation to make some exclusive control over that area. And China published the Arctic White Paper in 2018. Japan and US also that's kind of white paper last year. So what kind of US attitude or strategy toward the Arctic Ocean security? That's my question.
Yeah, Lucas?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, I've looked at Chinese sort of strategy in the Arctic and sort of US response. And the first thing that comes to mind is that there's a lot of discussion within the US national security community about the role of the Coast Guard once again, especially our icebreakers. But looking at sort of both China and Russia and their goals in the Arctic, a lot of it is in the sort of the Russian vicinity, and there's some discussion in open source Chinese scholarly works about perhaps even Russia allowing China to refuel some of its submarines and some of the northern, old but being refurbished Russian naval ports. Those are certainly very concerning. The actual economics of the Northern Passage, I think, is less concerning. From everything I read and understand about it, it is not a huge time saver or money saver. So it really does come down to, I think, security and defense issues. And I think when we look at a lot of the other Arctic countries, whether it's the Scandinavian ones or Canada, who we're very close with, we're watching it carefully. But I think that at this point, the goal is to also increase our capacity and our presence in that region. But right now, there's so many competing demands that I think that is definitely a challenge. I would point out that APCSS does have a sister organization that was recently established for, in part, this exact reason, which is to increase our focus and study of the changing factors and dynamics in the Arctic. But this is definitely an area of the global commons, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration and cooperation amongst both Arctic states and non-Arctic states to look at ways to manage these global commons and address, through hopefully international law and conventions, means of regulating it before it becomes too tense of an issue.
Earlier, we mentioned the spirit of Camp David and that it brought the three countries together to make some pledges and agreements that have been at a level that we haven't been willing to do before. We've been seeing some actual implementation of those as well. I guess I would ask, what measures will ensure the sustainability and the long-term effectiveness of trilateral maritime security cooperation? And then how might we further institutionalize this partnership? And so in our closing time, maybe we'll turn this attention now to the trilateral efforts. So I know maybe Tetsuo, we might even begin with you. I know that you can take on this one. You can even expand further. You know, China and Japan have made. Well, let me just let you take it from where you'd like to go first before I add to it.
Sure. So as I said in my presentation, I think there's now a big opportunity for the trilateral for the three countries to develop maritime security cooperation. And first of all, I think we have been done for example, the anti-submarine warfare exercises among the three countries, and we have done the missile defense exercise among the three countries. But I think we have to go beyond that. And I think, for example, we can do maritime security cooperation, assuming a Taiwan blockade by China in the East China Sea and beyond. And also, I think we can do trilateral naval exercises in the South China Sea. And plus, I think we can cooperate on the capacity building for the ASEAN member countries. I just learned the South Korea is now #1 arms exporter to the ASEAN member countries after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Russia is now under sanction. So, you know, Japan has a certain restriction on the providing military capacity to the foreign countries, but South Korea has a robust capabilities to do so. So I can see a possible division of labor among the three countries to further facilitate the capacity building assistance to the ASEAN member countries.
Thank you for that. Duk-ki or any of your colleagues there, Kim?
Okay, James, and I bring up one of my PPT material.
Yeah, of course.
That is a current operating status by the Korean government to prevent any kind of accidental naval incidents in the high seas and the skies. We have bilateral or multilateral cooperation measures with China and Russia and Japan. And nonetheless, problem is that China, we made the agreement in 2011. Nonetheless, China ignore our hotlines when we notify some kind of China's invasion of our KDG, but that kind of situation is currently. But nonetheless, and with Russia, we try to prevent by annual meeting by the two navies to prevent any kind of naval incident. That is similar to 1972 INSEE agreement between U.S. and the Soviet Union. And also we have direct hotlines with Japan like that. And Dr. Lee tried to mention more than how to enhance the bilateral maritime cooperation. Okay, Dr. Lee, please.
I'm Sang-Kap Lee again. I'd like to talk about two ideas to expand the cooperation between United States and Korea and Japan. Firstly, I'd like to suggest, we need to open official Navy talk in terms of trilateral Navy talks. I believe, between United States and Korea, and then Korea and Japan's self-defense Navy, and then we both have those, bilateral, Navy talks, which is regularizing, official talks between two leadership of naval forces. So from there, I think we can build up more practical, policy or actual, action against those military security threats. I think also this is the very right time to, more concrete, to make a more visualizing, outcome, because of the current Korean government is very active on the idea of, trilateral, military cooperation. I think this is the right opportunity we can't miss for the future's the security. Second is things that whenever I had a chance to participate when I was in military, I was a naval officer, and then I was in charge of the Korean team of the RIMPAC. So I think it's Japanese ships, lots of quite big forces have been participating in there, and then also Korea also participating very large part of the Korea Navy powers in the exercise. I think we can start those ideas whenever we participate. There is some kind of passage period. So I think it's because Japan and Korea, we have very similar location geographically to reach this Hawaii. I think is Japanese self-defense forces and Korean Navy, we can form combined fleet, and then we can sail, and then maybe we can sail around the South China Sea and Indonesia, and to go to Hawaii. I think we can start those sort of idea first, and then slowly we can build those trilateral regular paths around those area of disputed South China Sea. I think is times is still the current government is still still have some room to, still have a time to for possible next government. But I think is this is a very good opportunity for to pursue actively compared to the right now. I think we need to do more active action. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Lukas, any closing thoughts on this?
I fully agree. I love everything that you all have said. The emphasis on allies and partners and all that sounds fantastic. I did, if you allow it, to respond to something that Dr. Kotani had queried a little bit earlier, which was expressing some concern about the political flexibility of the United States to respond. And I absolutely agree with you on that. However, I also feel a little bit reassured that if you look at, for example, 9/11, things like the Emergency War Powers Act allow us to respond very quickly, even in the face of some political debate. And so, to me, I think if there was a really pressing crisis or something like an invasion of Taiwan, I don't think there would be much hesitation. I think there would be plenty of debate going on at the same time. But yes, I know it was a little bit off topic, but it was something that was kind of sticking in my head. So thank you.
Thank you for each of our distinguished guests for participating today. We have been deeply edified by the discussion that's going on. We've learned a tremendous amount. We appreciate our alumni base, which is joined in the greater public as well. We look forward to coming together as a collaborative body to be able to discuss these types of dynamic topics again in the future. Thanks for joining. We'll look to see you again. Aloha.